Hey everyone, how's it going? God Gamer here, and today I wanted to talk about why speedrunners rarely ever use Fury of the Fallen in speedruns. This is a question I get asked a lot because it seems like such an obvious thing to use in speedruns. In Hollow Knight, there's so many bosses that you have to kill, so it makes sense to increase your damage output as much as possible, and theoretically, Fury of the Fallen is an excellent way to do that. Anyone who's used an endgame build with Fury of the Fallen, Unbreakable Strength, and Quick Slash knows that the multipliers of each of those charms work together so well that you just melt bosses insanely fast. So if you could get that set up for a speedrun, it would be a huge advantage, right? And it is such a big advantage that some speedruns do make use of Fury of the Fallen. However, it's usually for shorter periods of time, like just for certain segments of the run, and then they unequip it and opt to use something else like Shaman Stone or Dash Master. And the only categories that I know of that equip Fury of the Fallen are categories where you have to get all the percent in the game. And charms, of course, are a percent, so it's like you have to pick up Fury of the Fallen, and speedrunners only use it if you have to pick it up. So one of the obvious answers as to why speedrunners don't use it is because it takes a lot of time to get. Picking up Fury of the Fallen is something you do right at the start of the game in King's Pass, and at that point in the game you don't have dash, you don't have wall jump, so you're moving really slowly through the area to get to the charm. Now speedrunners did find a trick where if you leave King's Pass right away, you can actually go and backtrack to Fury of the Fallen and then save and quit out, and it'll warp you back to where you were outside of King's Pass. This ends up saving a considerable amount of time, however, it still doesn't save enough time to make Fury of the Fallen worth it. So one of the most obvious reasons why it isn't really worth it is because Fury of the Fallen is a damage multiplier. It doesn't add base damage to the nail. Instead, it multiplies the damage that the nail already has. So Fury of the Fallen used to be a 150% damage boost, and it actually got buffed to 175%, which is an insane increase in your damage. However, the base nail only deals 5 damage. So if you've used Fury of the Fallen on a completed save file, your nail deals 21 base damage. And you're probably using Unbreakable Strength as well with Fury of the Fallen, which means your nail is at 32 damage. So when you consider the Fury of the Fallen effect, which is applied after Unbreakable Strength in the calculations, your nail damage is dealing 56 damage with an endgame build. So in other words, with an endgame build, Fury of the Fallen is increasing your damage by 24. That literally more than doubles your base nail damage of 21. So with an endgame build, Fury of the Fallen is absolutely insane. However, if your nail is only dealing 5 damage, 175% of that is 8.75. So in the calculations, the game rounds to the nearest integer, so 8.75 is rounded up to 9 damage. So while it is a huge relative increase, your nail damage is only going up by 4, and you don't have the multiplicative effects of Unbreakable Strength or Quick Slash that you'd normally have with an endgame build. Now you could consider getting Fragile Strength on the way to Mantis Claw, however that takes a lot of time to do because not only do you have to farm enough Geo to buy it, which is 600, you also have to get the Geo to unlock Leg Eater's shop in the first place, and farming Geo early game is actually really slow. There's only a few spots where you can efficiently get Geo, and some examples are False Knight's Geo Chest, Vengefly King, the Moss Knights in Green Path, but if you're farming all of those, you're easily adding minutes to the run, and you're never going to save that much time by just having slightly faster boss fights. So getting strength from Leg Eater is totally out of the question, and Quick Slash is all the way on the other side of the map if we're talking about the any percent speedrun. So if we're thinking about a Fury of the Fallen route for something like any percent, that's the only nail damage charm we're going to get. Everything else just takes way too much time. One thing you might think about, and something that we used to do in the any percent speedrun, is getting a nail upgrade. And while that is something we used to do, we actually found that it lost a significant amount of time. I'm not sure anyone knows the exact amount of time it lost. My guess is around a minute. It really does just take a lot of time to get that extra geo. Typically, you pick up an extra relic at some point, which is adding around at least 20 seconds. On top of that, you also have to sell the relic to Lem, which requires you to go through multiple dialogue boxes. And then you actually have to go to the nailsmith and get the nail upgrade, and that takes a lot of time as well. Now, one of the most effective relics to get is the relic after Watcher Knights. So after Watcher Knights, there's the Watcher Knights Geo Chest, which is one of the most effective Geo Chests in the game in terms of time, and right next to it is a hollowknight seal that we pick up, and it only takes a few seconds. So we really want to do Watcher Knights first, and then go sell relics to Lem after. However, if we're getting a nail upgrade, we would want that nail upgrade before we fight Watcher Knights to maximize the amount of time save we get from upgrading our nail. So if we go for that nail upgrade first, we have a less efficient route for Geo later because we have to skip the hollowknight seal after Watcher Knights because we're not going to go and sell to Lem twice. That would take way too much time. So nail upgrades just don't really fit into the any percent speedrun very well, and they just end up losing a significant amount of time. And this is just a trend overall with the any percent speedrun in Hollow Knight. People save time by completing the run with less things. So at the start of the any percent speedrun, people would get like Desolate Dive and Descending Dark and Isma's Tear and Crystal Heart, and then over time we started saving more and more time by just removing as many of those abilities as we could. The less abilities and less upgrades that you spend time getting, the faster the run is generally going to be. And that's largely because the amount of time that you save on bosses doesn't overcome the amount of time that it takes to get those extra abilities. So the other elephant in the room, of course, is Shaman Stone. Shaman Stone is an amazing charm, and we already get Vengeful Spirit in the any percent speedrun because it's the fastest way to kill the Elder Balder to get into Green Path. Vengeful Spirit allows you to do fireball skips, which can also save you a lot of time, and Vengeful Spirit is a great option when you have base nail damage. Vengeful Spirit often becomes your main damage dealer. So the fact that Shaman Stone not only increases the damage, but also increases the size of the hitbox makes it a really amazing charm. And by the way, increasing the hitbox of Vengeful Spirit actually has a bigger effect than you'd think. A bigger hitbox for Vengeful Spirit means that you have more of a chance to double hit enemies with the spell. And in case you don't know what double hitting is, when Vengeful Spirit hits an enemy, it'll typically knock that enemy back. And once it hits the enemy becomes invulnerable for a brief moment before it can be hit again. However, because it got knocked back by the spell, it becomes vulnerable before the spell fully passes through that enemy. So Vengeful Spirit can actually hit the enemy again before the spell flies away. And in some very specific circumstances, you can even triple hit enemies, for example, when the Watcher Knights are rolling away from you. So Shaman Stone is a no-brainer in the speedrun. And the fact that you can use Shaman Stone to get double hits on Umu, enabling the 2-cycle strategy, means that Shaman Stone is absolutely mandatory, even if you use Fury of the Fallen. One big difference between the two charms is that Umu cannot be 2-cycled with Fury of the Fallen alone, but using just Shaman Stone, you can do the Umu 2-cycle. And in case you don't know what the 2-cycle means, it just means killing Umu by the second time it becomes vulnerable. Because after each time Umu becomes vulnerable, Umu becomes invincible for like 20 seconds. So if you don't kill Umu during its vulnerable phase, you lose like 20 seconds instantly. And if the boss does an extra attack, which is just RNG, you're potentially losing even more time on top of that. So getting the 2-cycle is just absolutely mandatory in the speedrun. Otherwise, you're just gonna lose a ton of time. One other little consideration about Fury of the Fallen is that if you get it right away in any percent NMG, when are you going to equip it? Because you want to maximize the benefit from the charm by using it on every single boss possible. But in the any percent NMG route, the first time you're on a bench is after Hornet. So ideally, you would fight False Knight with Fury of the Fallen. Ideally, you'd also fight Hornet with Fury of the Fallen and get time save from those bosses. But if you wanted to use Fury for those fights, you'd have to bench in Dirtmouth because that's the only bench that you pass by without having to make a detour. But when you enter Dirtmouth, there's actually text that pops up on your screen, which signifies the area that you just entered. It just says Dirtmouth on the screen. And when you have that text on your screen, you're not allowed to sit on a bench. So you have to wait like 4 or 5 seconds just to sit on the bench to equip Fury. So that's just extra time loss. And something cool that the any percent NMG route does that a lot of people don't notice is that it actually doesn't take any bench in the early game. The only bench that the any percent NMG run gets early game is the bench next to Vengeful Spirit. And we're assigned that bench without actually sitting on it. That's because after the Vengeful Spirit section, you're actually automatically assigned to that bench without even touching it. So when we save and quit out after Hornet, we warp back to that bench next to Vengeful Spirit. And that's the first time we're on a bench in the route. So while you could theoretically save a few seconds by killing False Knight and Hornet with Fury of the Fallen, you're losing a significant amount of time by having to bench in Dirtmouth. Alternatively, you could sit on the bench while leaving Ancestral Mound and just not use Fury of the Fallen for False Knight, and that does seem like the optimal time to equip the charm. But if you do equip the charm at that point, there's one other consideration. Just before we do the Shade Skip, we always buy Shaman Stone and sit at the bench to equip it. And like I said, Shaman Stone is essentially a mandatory charm because of how it enables multi-hits and it lets us do the Umu 2 cycle. So it's not a matter of Fury of the Fallen or Shaman Stone, it's a matter of Shaman Stone or Shaman Stone and Fury. So we'd use the mechanic that a lot of people don't know about called overcharming. Overcharming allows you to exceed your normal charm notch cap, but in exchange you take double damage from all sources. So if something deals 1 damage, you take 2. If something deals 2 damage, you take 4. Now, if you're a speedrunner or if you have a speedrunner's brain, you might be like, oh, that's actually a good thing because that lets us get to 1 HP even faster. Every time you take damage, you actually lose a bit of time because there are freeze frames when you take that damage. So if you can avoid taking as many instances of freeze frames, then you're going to save time. So overcharming with Fury of the Fallen theoretically saves time. So overcharming, it's a good thing, right? In reality, it's not really that great. Overcharming has a few downsides that actually end up making it lose time. First of all, in order to perform the overcharm in the first place, you have to attempt to equip the charm multiple times, and each time the game says, no, you can't equip this. All told, overcharming takes about 10 seconds. And 10 seconds is not a trivial amount of time, because that 10 seconds is on top of the time it takes to get the charm as well. That's also on top of the time it takes to activate the charm prior to each encounter where you'd want to save time with it, because you have to take all those hits of damage, which freezes the game and causes you to lose little bits of time here and there. The other thing about overcharming is that it makes damage tanking strategies a lot less viable. There's a decent amount of strategies in the speedrun where taking damage actually saves you time. A lot of people might be curious about like damage boosting like you see in Super Metroid, because when you take damage, you might notice that you get knocked back in a direction. In Hollow Knight, that doesn't save time. Actually, if you damage boost in the correct direction, you lose about 1/4 of a second. But there are strats like the damage tank strat versus Devouts and Beastden that can save a significant amount of time. There's also the hazard warp in Queen's Gardens. For that, we fall into a very specific spot in the thorns, and the game kind of gets confused and warps you to the wrong side of those thorns. And that saves a decent amount of time. Now, for that section of the run, we have to do Queen's Gardens Acid Skip, which not everyone has 100% consistent because it's insanely hard, so there's a chance you might just fall into the acid and take damage. After that, we have that Thorns Hazard Warp, and shortly after that, we have the 2 Devouts in Beastden where we need to take damage. Now, you don't have to take damage in each of those spots, but it is a non-trivial amount of time to save. So for example, if you're overcharmed, you can only do a maximum of 2 of those damage tanks. So you're guaranteed, even if you play perfectly, to miss out on the 3rd. And taking the time to heal up isn't worth it because you really want to save soul for Vengeful Spirit. And that's assuming you play that segment perfectly. It's arguably the hardest segment in the run, so typically you have a bit of wiggle room for mistakes in that segment. If you're using Fury, you have absolutely no wiggle room for mistakes, and it's the hardest segment in the run. So do you really want to have Fury on in that segment? No. If you were using Fury in the route, you would unequip it before you get to that segment. The point in the run where you do that is at the Teacher's Archives bench on the way out after killing Umu. However, getting that bench is a small detour, and it takes time to actually menu to unequip the charm. You could equip the charm again after Beast's Den, or on the way to Hollow Knight when you Crystal Dash through the Black Egg Temple. And one last really small consideration is when you want to re-equip Fury of the Fallen, you actually have to unequip Shaman Stone first, because Shaman Stone fills all 3 charm notches. In order to overcharm, you have to have 1 free charm notch. When you have Shaman Stone equipped, you have no charm notches free, so you have to unequip Shaman Stone, equip Fury of the Fallen, and then equip Shaman Stone again. So there's so many little time losses that result from trying to add Fury of the Fallen into the route. Something a lot of people assume when they're not very familiar with Hollow Knight speedrunning is that speedrunners don't use Fury of the Fallen because it would be too difficult. And that's actually not the case at all. If Fury of the Fallen saved time, people would absolutely use it. Personally, I did a bunch of timing for this when I was really actively speedrunning in 2019, and Fury of the Fallen theoretically came close to almost saving enough time, but for a charm that forces you down to 1 HP and requires you to play perfectly, coming close to saving time isn't enough, because practically speaking, you're going to lose time because you're forced to take options that are safer. If you just play balls to the walls aggressive the whole time, you're going to randomly take damage to something that's outside of your control. For example, consider a situation where you're in the corner versus Watcher Knights, and one of them is rolling at you and one is bouncing. If you're doing a normal run, you can continue to deal damage without worrying too much about getting hit. If you're at 1 HP and you're on a world record pace, are you really going to take the risk, or are you going to play a little bit safer and exit from the corner? The reality is that pretty much everyone is going to play it a little bit safer, and playing safer often loses time. Now, of course, people use Fury of the Fallen for Pantheon speedruns because a lot of these things don't apply to those speedruns. You don't have to think about getting the charm, you don't have to think about equipping the charm, because the speedrun starts the moment you begin the Pantheon. So you can have all that stuff beforehand. Another big reason why Fury of the Fallen is viable in Pantheon speedruns, but not so much in full game, is because in Godhome you can unlock Lifeblood Cocoons. The Lifeblood Cocoons are unlocked by completing the Pantheons with bindings, so people can perform Pantheon 5 speedruns with the maximum amount of Lifeblood unlocked. And because you keep the Fury of the Fallen damage increase even if you pick up Lifeblood, it means you have insurance in case you take damage accidentally. Now, full game speedruns like with 112%, they don't have that Lifeblood. In order to unlock Lifeblood Cocoons, they would have to do 8 bindings. So the earliest possible time that you could unlock Lifeblood Cocoons is after the 2nd Pantheon. However, that would mean you would have to do Pantheon 1 and 2 with all bindings, and that not only slashes your nail damage, the amount of spells that you can cast at once, it also completely prevents you from equipping charms. So that would be a huge time loss. So something you could consider doing is doing 2 bindings for the first 4 Pantheons, and then by the time you get to Pantheon 5, you have Lifeblood. And of course, Pantheon 5 is the longest Pantheon by far, so that's the Pantheon that you want Fury for. Completing more bindings than 8 doesn't really offer enough benefit to even consider. Doing 8 bindings gives you 3 Lifeblood per cocoon. You could go up to 12 bindings and it would give you 4 Lifeblood per cocoon, but if you're taking so much damage that you need that much extra insurance, then you really shouldn't be running Fury in the first place. So could you use Fury of the Fallen in a full game speedrun? Theoretically, yes. However, you have the choice between unlocking the Lifeblood and having to use bindings in the first 4 Pantheons, or you have the choice of doing Pantheon 5 at the very end of a 3-hour speedrun without any lifeblood or insurance in case you get hit. Now, a ton of people have done Pantheon 5 hitless, so it's theoretically possible, but doing it at the end of a 3-hour speedrun where you're already exhausted from having to do such a marathon of a run, that's going to be really, really difficult to pull off. So could Fury save time in Pantheons? Yeah, Fury could save an insane amount of time in Pantheons. If you consider the best Pantheon 5 time in speedruns, it's 17 minutes and 20 seconds by Endel. The current world record for 112% has a 21 minute and 45 second Pantheon 5. That is almost 4 minutes of potential time save. Now keep in mind that's not just from Fury alone, that's also because of the fact that individual level speedruns are going to be so much more optimized. And 112% runners have so much else to optimize. It's not just like they're only playing Pantheon 5. They have the entire rest of the 3-hour run to think about. But still, that's multiple minutes of potential time save. And if you opted not to do any bindings, you'd also have time save in the other Pantheons should you use Fury there. So why don't 112% runners use Fury in the Pantheons? Of course, like I said, there's the fact that it's extremely risky at the end of an already super exhausting run, but there's also the fact that the run being so long means that there's so many other places that they can focus their energy on for saving time other than Fury. A lot of the runs do have deaths before the Pantheons, and it's just a result of the fact that they optimize the run so much and use so many risky strats that it just ends up being the case that they don't play perfectly for just one segment and they end up dying. There's just so many different things for them to practice, and as they get better and better, they're using more and more difficult strats. Those difficult strats means more of a chance of messing them up and dying. So what they're really focusing on is being able to execute those strats consistently rather than introducing an incredibly hard and risky strat at the very end of the run. Do I think people will eventually use Fury for 112%? That kind of depends on whether people are still running it when Silksong releases. But I think it's definitely a possibility that it will eventually be introduced. There's about 50 people who have done Pantheon 5 hitless, and it's a possibility that it could be done in a speedrun, but I do think that it'll be a while before anyone introduces it. That said, there's been so much competition in the category in 112% lately. People have just been trading the world record back and forth, and one of the contenders for the world record is actually Nightmare 31, who's known for being insane at Pantheon 5. So I'm really interested to see if Fury eventually gets used in that speedrun. There's just so many things nowadays to be excited about in the Hollow Knight speedrunning community. So if you're a fan of Hollow Knight speedrunning, I definitely encourage you to check out some of those top players who are doing these runs. But that said, I think that's all I have to say about Fury of the Fallen in speedruns. Hopefully this gives you some insight into speedrunning and why we typically choose not to use the charm. Hope you all enjoy the video and hope you have a wonderful day. Peace.